Okay, so I didn't really have embedded tutorials in this particular assignment because most of the explanations just follow in the next question. So I'm just going to make a quick tutorial to make sure you got what this was saying. And I think this is a really important topic in today's political climate. As I said, there's a lot of issues about race and racism, and so we really need to understand the biological basis of race and whether it's really even meaningful. And so there's two hypotheses about the origin of all the human races. So let me go through those first. So this is years ago, right? So the idea that the multi-regional hypothesis is the idea that races are actually very ancient. Those in Asia, Europe, Oceania, Africa are very ancient, that they split from primitive hominids long time ago, like 1.8 to 2 million years ago. There might have been a little bit of genetic admixture, but for the most part, these are very ancient and meaningful races. The out of Africa hypothesis suggests that maybe that occurred, but those all went extinct, and that really all of humanity comes out of a line of Homo erectus or somewhere around there, around 100,000, 150,000 years ago. And so they're relatively new races that ended up in the different continents, and so race is less meaningful. Okay, and so one of the things it asks, looking at the hypotheses, the multi-regional hypothesis would predict what differences between races than the out of Africa. So if they're older, they have more time to have genetic divergence from each other. So you would predict that the multi-regional races would have a lot more differences between races than if it's out of Africa and they're a lot younger. And so then scientists actually went out to try to predict which one was more supported by the data by looking at the genetics of modern humans. And so in this one, they were looking at the DNA evidence of a 40,000-year-old Neanderthal and looking at it compared to modern humans. So this is the whole modern human clade. And here's Neanderthal. And what we can see from the number of differences, and sorry, by the way, Neanderthal is like the European way of pronouncing it. Neanderthal is what we as Americans say. And I kind of flip back and forth between the two. To be quite honest. Anyway, so if you look at the differences in our DNA, it predicts that all of modern humanity is less than 170,000 years old as far as genetic divergence. And so that would suggest that the out of Africa hypothesis is likely more true. And then we look at divergence times here. So you know that like Homo sapiens diverged from chimps and bonobos 5 to 7 million years ago. And so the human chimps, they diverged from each other the chimp bonobos diverged about 1.5 million years ago. And so the multi-regional hypothesis would predict that the genetic between human races versus between chimps and bonobos. So the multi-regional says that we diverged longer than 1.5 million years ago, so we should have more diversity amongst our human races than the chimps and bonobos have amongst them, if the multi-regional hypothesis would be correct. Does that make sense? Because we diverged a lot older than they did, and so we would have lots more variety. And so if we look at the genetic diversity, look at how much diversity. So this is looking at the percent sequence divergence, so how different they are, and the percent of the total comparisons that they did. And you can see that amongst gorillas, there's huge variety. If you look even amongst bonobos themselves, or even just Western chimpanzees, there's a ton of variety in their genetics, whereas all of modern humans fit in this tiny little less than 5%, less than 8% difference. And so that suggests that we are way young, that human races are way young. And so out of Africa is a more likely scenario. And then again, we look at these and we look at the different races that they've looked at. So these are people coming out of Africa in green, and the non-African races, you can see the Dutch, the French, the German, and you can see them here in red. And so you can see that we're very closely related, but the more divergent ones are the African races, suggesting that our lineage came out of Africa. The African races are more basal. They are more representative of the original population that came out of Africa. And so then we have these common designations for race, right? White, Black, Pacific Islander, Asian, Australian Aborigine, Native American. And so we want to test whether these really are meaningful differences. And so what we really want to know is, do whites have very different genetics than blacks, and then different genetics than Pacific Islanders? Are we really genetically different enough to say that these are meaningful designations? And so we went out in search of like a gene that might be typical of one race. And so cystic fibrosis is one of those that's typically seen amongst white people. But if you look at how much cystic fibrosis, other endocrine disorders, hemoglobinopathies, or things like sickle cell anemia, etc., you find that they are like all over the place in all different ethnicities. And so cystic fibrosis is certainly not specific to white people. That's the one in the white. We see it in Asian, East Indian, Middle Eastern, blacks, whites, more in Native Americans, Hispanics. We see it everywhere. So then we looked at sickle cell anemia, which is traditionally seen as like a black disease of African descent. And what we see is that sickle cell anemia is kind of all over the place. You can see some of the lighter pink down in Australia and New Zealand. You see this gene, so it's not just amongst African people. And if you look at the malaria incidence and sickle cell incidence, they completely overlap. So really, the sickle cell allele is being driven by the malaria presence rather than the color of their skin, for example. It's not a very basal, inherited, ancient gene that would signify that this is one race. And so then here, if races represent different populations, what would you expect regarding genetic differences? Well, you should see that within race difference, or I'm sorry, between race differences, so between blacks and whites, you'd see more variety than within the black population, for instance. And that's just simply not true. When we look at a bunch of different genes, so these are just the different genes that they looked at, the haptoglobin 1 allele, excuse me, the PTC tasting allele. This particular, I have no idea what it does on chromosome 8. But what we see is that even in the same race, so like Asians, they have the highest frequency and one of the lowest frequencies. Here we see that for this particular allele, they have the highest and the lowest in blacks, right? Asians here, the highest and the lowest. There is no pattern, meaning that we have not been able to find a single gene that genetically would say, like I could look at the genes and say, yes, you're definitely a black, for instance. There is just so much variety within our races rather than between our races that race genetically is sort of a ridiculous concept. And if we can understand that gosh, we are more similar than we are different, even though we have these crazy physical characteristics that may seem like a really big deal, genetically they're very small. And so what is driving these differences? Well, there's a lot of things. So nose shape, for instance. What we find is that if you live in cold and dry climates, your nose is more narrow and long. If you live in hot, warm climates, your nose is more flat and wide. And that's just because we need a longer chamber to moisten and warm the air before it hits our brain if we're in cold temperatures. And so you see that the environment is driving the shape of the nose. You can look at these two particular populations. These are both black populations. This is living in a dry, hot climate, or a hot, humid climate, excuse me, and this is living in a cold, dry climate. And so you can see the difference in the nose shape, even though the skin color is the same. And then skin color, obviously, skin color is driven incredibly by the environment. So vitamin D is required so you don't get rickets, right? And folic acid is required for the neural tube to close in embryonic development. And the sunlight plays a role in both of these. So the sunlight is required to make vitamin D. We make a precursor to vitamin D, but then the UV rays have to hit it to turn it into vitamin D. And so we have to be able to get a certain amount of sunlight to have healthy amounts of vitamin D. But the sunlight, the UV rays, also obliterate folic acid. And so if you are in areas where there's really high sun, like around the equator, your folic acid is getting just obliterated and you're getting plenty of vitamin D. So it benefits you to have more pigment in your skin to block sunlight. You'll still get plenty of vitamin D and you won't destroy your folic acid and end up with babies with spina bifida, right? And so as you move more towards the poles, however, as humans started migrating towards the poles, then we end up with this issue of they're not getting enough vitamin D. They're blocking all the sunlight, so their folic acid is fine, but they're not getting vitamin D. And so we get these weird mutations like I have of the MC1R that gives you this really white, pasty skin. And that actually allows you to soak in more vitamin D in high northern and southern latitudes. And so you see this clear demarcation of skin colors by latitude, right? So it's definitely not an issue of your actual underlying genetic history. It's more an issue of where you lived, where your ancestors lived, where they evolved. And so we have the same thing with eye shape, right? You see eye shape like that in Asians and in Aborigines, which are not related at all, but we think a related climate. We're not actually sure on eye shape, but there's a couple of hypotheses here. So the basic take-home message is that race is not meaningful from a biological standpoint. It is completely a social construct. And so certainly one we can overcome. And that's it.